all the way back to 2002, a rather notorious case, the murder of Lacey Peterson in Northern California. Where is that, Modesto? Am I right
Yeah.
that that was Modesto?
Yeah, it was Modesto.
Modesto, California. Talk a little bit about the investigation. And I know some people will say, hey, why in the world are you talking about this now, 22 years later? And some of our astute listeners, Mark, will say, the LA Innocence Project. They filed an appeal on behalf of Scott Peterson, the husband of Laci, or the person that was convicted for the murder. Let's put it that way.
I call him the self-imposed widower.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's something we'll talk about too, how he said he was a widow before his wife even died, which is an interesting trick. Turning back the clock to 2002, this was still a period in California that I referred to as, brace yourself, the OJ hangover days. Meaning that anytime you had a jury trial at that time, there was some fear of jury nullification. There was some fear that no matter what evidence you put on, the jury would just say, we're not convicting this guy. In this Peterson case, although there's significant evidence, there's not a lot of traditional evidence. There's no crime scene, there's no murder weapon, and there's really no method of death, to my knowledge. But yet he was convicted. In my opinion, because of what happened with the OJ case, there was really the mindset of prosecutors when they had someone they were charging was, we're going to convict this guy, right?
Right.
Now, you remember a couple of weeks ago, Mark, we talked about the documentary American Nightmare.
Yes.
A case where, a domestic violence case, police thought it was a murder. Some similarities, you could say, at least with the Vallejo theory of what happened, thinking that Denise Huskins was murdered, right? What day did that documentary get released to the public? So American Nightmare, the documentary, was released to the public January 17th, 2024. What day did the LA Innocence Project file their appeal in this case on behalf of Scott Peterson?
It was a couple of days later.
January
days later.
18th,
Yep.
January 18th.
One day later.
Right. And so my point is, Mark, that's not a coincidence,
Yeah.
right? They were trying to ride the wave that American Nightmare created, a case where there was a lot of criticism on tunnel vision of law enforcement, on what did we call it? Confirmation bias, not
pretty much.
looking, just having their theory and just going all ahead to prove their theory, regardless of what other evidence came up. And the LA Innocence Project, in my opinion, said, hey, we're gonna ride that wave. We're gonna file this appeal, and we're gonna make this case seem very similar to that case that the public is now behind, and we may get Scott Peterson a new trial.
I think your theory, Bill, is dead on.
Right. And it's just opportunism, just so people understand that. It happens all the time in our justice system, and maybe it's a particular jury verdict that then everyone looks at and says, wow, this person was convicted with this type of evidence. Now we need this type of evidence. Remember, now everything's DNA. Even, is there a law that says you need DNA evidence to prove that this person possessed a handgun? No, there's not. But really, it's become almost a necessary part of every case. You have to have DNA evidence. So looking back at this case, Mark, you want to start just talking about what some of the circumstantial evidence was in the case, or the timeline of it? I remember, Christmas Eve, 2002. Mark, Scott Peterson.
Careful there.
Wait,
Yeah.
right.
Yes, my wife is alive and kicking, and it's going to be that way until I croak first.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Scott Peterson wakes up in the morning. He says he and his wife watch the Martha Stewart show. That was the last thing they did together. And then he goes off fishing for the day, drives 90 miles away. Now, they asked him what was on the Martha Stewart show that you watched, and his recollection was it was some kind of meringue, if I'm remembering correctly. They baked some kind of meringue pie, and the police contacted the network, researched that particular show, and said, no, in fact, that was not what was on that day. So there was no meringue being prepared. So that's evidence that he murdered his wife. A lot of little things like that in his stories, which they paint a picture of him as not the brightest guy in the world, but don't necessarily really lend any evidence to the fact that he murdered his wife. The boat. Throughout the trial, this boat that he purchased was referred to as a fishing boat.
Mhm.
It's a 14-foot open boat, Mark. I would call that more of a rowboat. Would you call that a fishing boat?
Yeah, I'm not a fisherman myself, but I have a boat and out in the marina a lot. And I agree with you. This sounds like a purchase of convenience and specific utility, not necessarily for somebody who is planning to go fishing.
Mhm.
But Scott Peterson hadn't had a valid fisherman's license, I think, for I don't know, 20 something years before this. And a couple of days before Lacey turns up missing, he goes out and purchases a fishing license good for only 2 days and buys a boat to go fishing. You talk about circumstantial evidence. And again, these are just a couple of almost endless examples of circumstantial evidence. So, Bill, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, no. So some of the strange things, strange parts of this case, Mark, it was, I think according to the testimony at trial, or even his own defense lawyer referred to him as a serial philanderer, said that he had multiple affairs, and his wife, or Lacey, had never confided in anyone that they were having any kind of marital problems, right? That's
Mhm.
interesting, right?
Yes.
No one knew that he had not. I guess his wife didn't even know he bought a boat, or they hadn't shared it outside the family. We don't know what she knew, but no one outside the
Right.
family knew that he had bought a boat.
And,
What else?
and anyone in the family, in other words, the in-laws, things like
Right.
this, siblings. The other thing again, it's all circumstantial. And Bill, you made such a good point about we live in a day and age now where because of all these crime scene shows and people think that there's like a 95% solve rate in homicides, and you go out there and you put two and two together, you get the DNA, you get this forensic and blah blah, eventually leads you to somebody in 8 hours. It doesn't work like that. Many people testified to this, that Scott Peterson, a couple of days before Lacey turned up missing, he had gone around to talking to different neighbors about his plans to go fishing, talking to different
Mm,
neighbors about this, making sure that there are going to be third party witnesses that could provide an alibi for, oh, yeah, he told us he was going fishing, things like this. When in the hell do you go around talking to your neighbors, especially for someone who apparently hadn't been fishing for the longest time, and now you're going to go out by yourself? By the way, in 40-degree weather, apparently, there's so many aspects to this that don't make any sense. He just so happened to mention his wife's demise to his girlfriend. Coincidentally, in the very same week, he abruptly evinced an interest in fishing for the first time since the 1990s. Coincidentally, buying the same boat where her hair would later be found, after he coincidentally went fishing in the same region of the bay where her body would eventually be found, all while coincidentally lying repeatedly about his own actions. In a fictional scenario, it might be fun to imagine that all those details could be the result of some bizarre surprise explanation. But in the real world, a world where homicide by the intimate partners is a leading cause of death for pregnant women, would we know better? And again, this is almost a summation of the article, and they do a very good job of articulating some of these coincidences in there. But this is where grown-ups, this is where objective people actually look at the totality of the
right.
circumstances. Like you said, Bill, not just the lack of DNA, because listen, everybody before, I'm pick a date, the early 1990s, everybody convicted of murder up to that point was convicted without DNA evidence, right?
Mhm.
Not zero biological evidence, obviously, because you have blood matches and things like this where we're not totally determinative, but they can exclude other people. So before that, we had people that were convicted of murder. It was basically through eyewitness accounts, other physical evidence, and circumstantial evidence. And we have probably at least as much circumstantial evidence in this case, if not more, than we had in the O.J. Simpson case in 1994, went to trial in 95. And I'm going to talk
Mhm.
about that kind of interesting nexus between the two cases here in a little bit. The totality of all of the coincidences that would have had to have take place in order for this man to be innocent are really beyond any I think fair-minded person's ability.
Agree. Agree 100%. A couple other things. Before several days, if not a week or more, before Lacey went missing, he told his girlfriend, Amber Frye, that he was a widower, right?
Yes.
So,
Well,
yeah,
I think what I read in the article, Bill, is said that I had lost my wife.
right. And then I don't know, the one that's very damning, the purchase of 90 pounds of concrete. Purchased 90 pounds of concrete, said that he wanted to use it for a boat anchor. And I think they showed that the boat anchor was only a small portion of that 90 pounds. And they asked him, so what did you do with the rest of it? And he said, I patched my driveway. And they went and examined the driveway, and they found that the concrete in the driveway was actually a completely different type of concrete than he had purchased. So what happened to the other, I don't know how much, they didn't say, but the other 80 pounds, whatever it was, of concrete. And the theory is that he made weights to weight down the body when the body was dumped in the ocean.
And if I remember
Yeah,
correctly, which is not in this article I'm referring to, but I do remember that they found the molds or concrete dust in the garage, if I remember correctly. So they actually found a direct physical link to, in other words, the use of the concrete that he purchased on his
right.
property. Mhm.
Right, they did, and then I think also, in the boat, and of course, he would say, "Well, that's from the one anchor that I did use," but they were almost, I think, able to show in the boat where these other weights or whatever they were sitting just based on imprints and dust that was left in the boat.
And by the way,
Um
Bill, when you're considering the circumstantial evidence, it was a very small boat that he purchased.
mhm,
Why anybody would have to purchase concrete in order to cast their own anchor for this boat is beyond me. I In other words, that story in and of itself, I guess maybe it's done. I guess there's something that says you can't make your own anchor out of concrete, but why you wouldn't be able simply to purchase an
mhm.
aluminum or an iron anchor, the same place where you purchased the boat, it seems like it'd be a lot easier, a lot less intrusive in your time. But that's just an ancillary observation.
So Lacey disappeared Christmas Eve. Amber Fry, I guess, came forward about a month later. It was sometime in the middle, late January.
Mhm.
And she called police because she saw him on TV, and she said, "Hey, I've been dating this guy." Some of the stories, I guess the best way to say it is some of the elaborate stories that he told her about his whereabouts and what he was doing. For example, he was at a vigil for Lacey when she was missing, and he was actually on the phone with Amber Fry and said he was in Paris and he was overlooking the Eiffel Tower. He was on a business trip and et cetera. It's just these very elaborate stories and lies that he told were a little bit out there, right?
A little bit. I put that in quotes. They were
Yeah.
way out there, but it just goes to show uh, the level of continuous dishonesty from this guy, going back to his infidelity with his wife even before the marriage started, and almost continuously, and then these different statements. That one right there is completely provable. Provable. He says that he was in Paris. It's pretty easy to find out if someone was in Paris or not, if they were in fact at a candlelight vigil for his now at this time missing wife. So
Yeah.
his credibility there, I think, is in question at least.
The police reclassify the case now as a homicide case.
Mhm.
And I think the body was recovered sometime in April, if I'm not mistaken,
I
washed
believe
up on
that's
the
right.
shore. And
Mhm.
and Mark, how close was it? Do you know how close that was to where he went fishing? I think it was relatively close to where he was, the marina where he went fishing, was it not?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly in miles, but it was very, very close. And here's the thing, if I remember this off the top of my head, I think it was about 90 or 100 miles from his residence, from Lacey's residence to this area where he was fishing and where the body eventually surfaced. And when you think about that alone, Bill, just the likelihood that, oh, I just so happened to go fishing. It would be one thing if there were 3 or 4 lakes or bodies of water within a couple of miles of your house, and you
Hmm.
went fishing there, and the body of your deceased wife surfaces in one of the same areas. I think anybody could claim that, well, yeah, this water's right here, and that's where she was murdered. Someone took her there. But it just so happens he drove 90 or 100 miles from his house to go fishing in a particular place in the San Francisco Bay. And just by pure horrible luck for him, his body's wife surfaces in the same general area.
Hmm. Yeah.
Coincidence?
Right. Very unlikely. Very
No.
unlikely. So after the body was although, Mark, I've heard people say on this case, I think, and this goes to the necessity to keep information confidential. And with a case like this, it was so hard because the news media was all over it. But even I don't know if it was a trial or maybe this was just speculation outside of the trial, but the police had said early on, right, that he said he was fishing. So the defense theory that, hey, the people that actually did the murder, they heard this and that's where they disposed of the body to pin it on him, right?
Yeah, there's a little problem with that, but go ahead.
You're right. But I think that does go to the need for confidentiality when you're conducting an investigation. You have to really try not to let that information get out in the public because it has an impact and can put holes in your own case.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And there's always a balance. I think both know when we're talking about a missing persons case, there's always a balance about the confidentiality, the integrity of the investigation
Mhm.
versus what assistance you can gain from public interest, public awareness, what tips you might get. At some point, that scale starts sliding in favor of releasing information because your case is growing cold without any other leads. And so
Right.
again, I don't think there's any exact science to this, but certainly you're talking about a case going cold. Eventually you have to start releasing some information. So, but you're 100% right, Bill. If you release it too soon or too much, it certainly can muddy the waters, pardon the pun, right now for your investigation.
Right. So he was arrested a short time after the body was recovered. In his car, Mark, talk about more circumstantial evidence. He had rope, knives, 4 cell phones, camping supplies, children's books, which we can talk about in a minute, $15,000 cash, his brother's ID, hiking boots, a shovel, a fishing pole. The police described the scene as, this is a quote, "This guy is like James Bond without the secret agent mission. He dyes his hair blonde. Said it happened in his friend's pool, that it was like bleach from the chlorine in his friend's pool."
Look, OJ Simpson claimed that he cut his hand on the door of the limousine when he was getting ready to go to the airport at 11 o'clock at night or midnight or things like that. And of course, that was ludicrous face value. Matter of fact, if I remember correctly, OJ Simpson, over time, that's right, he claimed that he cut his hands 3 different ways in 3 different locations, by the way. I remember
Mhm.
two. One was in Chicago. He cut it on some glass in a hotel room sink. And then he cut it in the limousine door. I forget the third way. My point is that something like this, when you hear these types of statements that, yeah, my hair turned color because of the swimming pool, it implies that every time you go swimming in a swimming pool, your hair turns a different color.
Mhm.
And of course, I just don't think that it's so ludicrous. It is so ludicrous. And again, you couple this with all of the other inconsistencies over and over and over. Listen, anybody can make a claim, or strange circumstances can happen to anybody once or twice, maybe a few times over a long period of time. But when almost everything that you claim is either at face value really far-fetched, or it's easily proven to be untrue. In other words, over and over and over. That's where you start building a case of circumstantial evidence. And that's what we have here. There was nothing that Scott Peterson said that was ever really proven to be accurate.
Right.
Nothing that I can think of, that I can remember, or what I've read recently.
Yeah, there was even some speculation when because I think I read somewhere that he had a gun with him as well when he was stopped, but I didn't see it in this article I was just describing where they recounted what was in his car. But there was speculation that his plan may have been to find Amber Frye and murder her. I mean, that's something that I read a little bit in a couple articles, that the speculation was that's where he was headed if he wasn't arrested that day.
Yeah, I remember something about that, and of course, it is speculation. We'll never
Yep.
know
Yep.
what was coursing through his mind. But is that possible? Of course, it's possible, but who knows? By the way, if reading from the article again here, it's just the same day their bodies were found, Lacey and Connor, their unborn child, Scott Peterson, died us here, borrowed his brother's photo ID, and headed for the Mexico border with over $15,000. This
Mhm.
is $10,000 in cash. And the final jury needed just 7 hours to convict him and ultimately sentence him to death, which we'll talk about in a minute, about the death penalty
Yeah.
being overturned. But again, that behavior, if you are innocent, if you know that you didn't commit the crime, there really is no reason to try to secrete your movements, your appearance, and then to flee. You would stay. First of all, thank God, or not thank God, but at least they found my wife's body. Now we
Mhm.
have it. We have something that we can work with as far as finding the true killer.